The room was already tense, but no one expected what happened next. Cameras were rolling. Lawmakers were leaning forward in their seats. Every question in the hearing room was getting sharper, more aggressive, and then suddenly the tension exploded. One lawmaker tried to corner Pam Bondi with a line of questioning that seemed designed to put her on the defensive. But instead of backing down, Bondi pushed back hard. What followed was a moment that instantly changed the tone of the entire hearing. Voices rose, the room went silent, and for a few seconds, everyone realized this wasn't going to be a routine political exchange. It was turning into a showdown. In the moment Bondi responded, the entire room felt it. At first, the hearing looked like any other government proceeding. Members of the U.S. House Judiciary Committee sat behind long wooden desks arranged in a wide semicircle across the chamber. In front of them were thick folders, stacks of printed documents, and neatly placed microphones waiting to capture every word spoken in the room. The setting felt formal and controlled, exactly the way most congressional hearings are designed to be. Staff members moved quietly behind the lawmakers, whispering last-minute reminders and passing small notes across the desks. Some aides flipped through legal briefings, while others checked their phones for updates from colleagues outside the room. Along the back wall, reporters had already settled into their seats. Laptops were open. Cameras were positioned carefully to capture the best angles. Every journalist in the room knew that hearings like this could sometimes produce moments that quickly make headlines. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. She sat calmly at the witness table, a microphone positioned directly in front of her, and a glass of water placed neatly to the side. From the outside, she appeared composed and focused, the way someone with years of legal experience often looks when stepping into a high-pressure setting. Bondi was already well known in both legal and political circles. Before arriving at this hearing, she had spent years serving as the Attorney General of Florida, one of the most prominent legal roles in the state. During that time, she had dealt with major investigations, courtroom battles, and intense political debates. In other words, she wasn't new to scrutiny. She had faced tough interviews, she had handled aggressive cross-examinations, and she had spent countless hours explaining and defending her decisions in front of critics, reporters, and lawmakers. Still, hearings like this were never routine. Even experienced officials understood that the environment inside a congressional hearing room could change very quickly. What begins as a calm exchange of questions and answers can suddenly become far more intense, depending on the direction of the conversation. Everyone in the room seemed aware of that possibility. The committee members had clearly prepared carefully for the hearing. Many of them had thick briefing books open in front of them, with pages marked by colored tabs and handwritten notes in the margins. Those notes represented hours of preparation. Staff teams had spent days reviewing documents, researching past statements, and organizing questions designed to get clear answers. Some of the questions would likely be straightforward, basic clarifications about policy, decisions requests for timelines, questions about procedures and legal interpretations. But other questions were clearly designed to go deeper. Some lawmakers intended to challenge Bondi's past actions. Others wanted explanations about controversial decisions made during her time in office, and everyone knew those questions could push the conversation into more difficult territory. At first, though, the exchanges remained calm and professional. The committee chair opened the session with formal remarks, outlining the purpose of the hearing and reminding everyone about the rules of the proceeding. Then the questioning began. One lawmaker after another took their turn speaking into the microphone. Each question was followed by a measured answer from Bondi. The rhythm of the hearing settled into a familiar pattern. A question, a pause. An answer. Occasionally, a follow-up. From the outside, it looked like a typical government hearing playing out exactly as expected. Bondi responded carefully to each inquiry, choosing her words with the precision that experienced attorneys are known for. Sometimes she referred to documents in front of her. Other times, she relied on her memory of events and decisions made years earlier. Throughout the early part of the hearing, the tone remained respectful. No raised voices, no interruptions, just a steady exchange between lawmakers and the witness seated before them. But slowly, almost subtly, the atmosphere in the room began to shift. You could feel it building, little by little. Some of the later questions were noticeably sharper than the earlier ones. Lawmakers began referencing specific decisions and statements, sometimes reading lines from documents aloud before asking Bondi to respond. The pauses between questions grew slightly longer. Several members leaned forward in their chairs, listening more closely. Reporters in the back of the room started typing more quickly, sensing that the discussion might be heading toward more serious territory. The tone of the questions became more pointed, less general, more focused on specific moments in Bondi's career. And as that shift happened, it became clear that at least one lawmaker on the committee was preparing to press much harder than anyone else had so far. They shuffled through their notes, reviewed a document placed in front of them, and leaned slightly closer to the microphone. For a brief moment, the room felt unusually quiet. Even the soft whispering from staff members seemed to stop. People were waiting, watching, because everyone could sense what was about to happen. Next, the calm opening phase of the hearing was ending, and the real confrontation was about to begin. The moment arrived when one member of the committee leaned forward and began a new line of questioning. The shift in the room was subtle at first. Up until that point, the hearing had followed a predictable rhythm. Lawmakers asked their questions, witnesses responded, and the discussion moved forward in a steady, procedural way. But now something about this exchange felt different. The lawmaker adjusted the papers in front of them and spoke with a tone that carried a sharper edge than before. Less neutral, more confrontational. The room seemed to notice immediately. Staff members who had been quietly taking notes looked up from their laptops. Reporters in the press section leaned forward slightly. Even some of the committee members turned their attention more closely toward the exchange that was beginning to unfold. The lawmaker began laying out a series of statements, one after another. Each statement referenced decisions made during the years when Pam Bondi served as Attorney General of Florida. The questions were carefully structured, almost like steps in an argument. First came references to specific policies, then mentions of investigations that had taken place years earlier. Then came a suggestion that some of those decisions might deserve closer scrutiny. The lawmaker paused, then asked Bondi to respond. At first, Bondi simply listened. She sat still in her chair at the witness table, hands resting near the stack of documents in front of her. Her expression remained calm, controlled, and focused. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react visibly. Anyone watching closely could see that she was paying attention to every word. This wasn't new territory for her. During her years as Florida's top legal official, Bondi had faced intense questioning in courtrooms, press conferences, and legislative hearings. Moments like this were part of the job. Still, the implication behind the questions was becoming clearer with every sentence the lawmaker spoke. The tone suggested something more than routine oversight. It hinted at criticism, perhaps, even an attempt to challenge decisions that had been made years earlier. For a brief moment, the room grew quiet. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a hearing room where people wait politely for the next speaker. It was the kind of quiet that comes when everyone senses a pivotal moment approaching. The kind of silence where even the sound of someone turning a page feels unusually loud. Across the room, television cameras remained fixed on the witness table. Reporters held their pens ready. Everyone was waiting to see how Bondi would respond. Would she deflect the question? Would she give a brief answer and try to move on? Or would she confront the implication directly? Bondi finally moved. She leaned slightly forward toward the microphone. The movement was small, but it carried weight. Her posture straightened as she prepared to speak, and when she did, her voice was steady, direct, measured. She didn't begin with a long explanation or attempt to avoid the issue. Instead, she addressed the premise of the question head-on. Bondi explained that every decision made during her time as Attorney General had followed the procedures required under the law. Investigations, she said, were handled by professional staff and career prosecutors who reviewed evidence and applied legal standards. Before any conclusions were reached, her tone remained calm. But there was a firmness in the way she spoke. This was not someone backing away from the criticism. It was someone answering it. She reminded the committee that public officials often face difficult choices. Legal decisions are rarely simple. They involve reviewing evidence, consulting legal experts, and determining whether the facts meet the legal threshold required to take action. Bondi emphasized that the role of an attorney general is not to pursue headlines or political pressure. It is to follow the law. She also pointed out that many of the decisions now being questioned had already been reviewed publicly at the time they were made. Investigations had been documented, reports had been filed, and oversight had existed then, just as it did now. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the room shifted again. The earlier tension didn't disappear, but it changed. Instead of waiting for a defensive response, the room was now watching a direct explanation unfold. Some committee members nodded slightly as they listened. Others continued studying their notes. The lawmaker who had asked the question listened carefully, occasionally glancing down at their prepared remarks. Bondi concluded her answer by returning to a broader point. Public service, she said, requires accountability. But it also requires fairness. Questions should always be asked, but they should also be based on facts and context. When she finished speaking, the room remained quiet for a brief second. It was the pause that often follows a strong response, the moment when people absorb what has just been said. Then, the hearing moved forward. Another lawmaker prepared to speak. The next round of questions was about to begin, but for many people in the room, the moment that stood out had already happened. The moment when the tone shifted. The moment when the questioning became sharper, and the moment when Bondi chose not to avoid the challenge, but instead leaned forward and answered it directly. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted the moment Pam Bondi began her response. Up until that point, the exchange had followed the familiar rhythm of a congressional hearing. A lawmaker would pose a question, the witness would respond, and the conversation would move along to the next topic. But this moment felt different. The tone of the question suggested more than simple curiosity. It carried an implication, one that seemed to frame Bondi's past decisions in a very specific and critical way. For a brief second, the room fell into a quiet pause. Bondi leaned slightly toward the microphone, her expression calm but focused. Rather than simply accepting the premise of the question, she addressed it head-on. She made it clear that the characterization being presented was, in her view, incomplete and potentially misleading. Her voice remained measured and steady, the kind of tone that comes from years of courtroom experience. But the substance of what she was saying left little doubt about her position. She was not going to allow the narrative implied in the question to stand without challenge. Bondi began by explaining that the situation being discussed could not be understood through a single sentence or a simplified interpretation. Legal decisions, she pointed out, rarely happen in isolation. They happen within context. They happen within the boundaries of law, and they happen based on the information available at the time. As she spoke, she laid out the responsibilities her office held during that period. As the state's top legal officer, she explained, every major decision had to pass through layers of legal analysis, review, and consultation. The process was not a matter of personal preference or political convenience. It was a matter of law. Bondi emphasized that the choices being questioned were made after careful evaluation of the facts presented to her office. Investigators, attorneys, and legal staff had all played roles in examining the evidence before any final determination was reached. In other words, she suggested, the decision was not a simple or rushed judgment, it was the result of a legal process. As she continued speaking, the atmosphere in the room began to change. What had started as a routine line of questioning was now drawing focused attention from nearly everyone present. Members of the committee leaned forward in their seats. Some lawmakers listened carefully, their eyes fixed on the witness table. Others flipped through thick stacks of briefing papers, searching for notes or documents related to the exchange. Behind them, aides whispered quietly to one another. Reporters, seated along the edges of the room, began typing more rapidly on their laptops. It was clear that the conversation had moved beyond ordinary procedural questioning. The lawmaker who had initiated the line of inquiry responded with another question, pressing Bondi further on the details. The tone was sharper now, more direct. Bondi answered just as directly. She elaborated on the legal framework her office operated under and reminded the committee that decisions made years earlier must be evaluated according to the facts and legal standards that existed at that moment in time. Hindsight, she suggested, can make past events look simpler than they truly were. But legal decision-making rarely offers perfect clarity in the moment. The exchange continued. Another question, another response. Each time Bondi spoke, she returned to the same central point: context matters. Without understanding the full legal and factual background of a case, she argued, it becomes easy to draw conclusions that do not accurately reflect what actually happened. Her responses were detailed and methodical, reflecting the careful language often used by attorneys who know their words will be scrutinized. The lawmaker, however, continued to probe. Some questions were framed broadly, others focused on specific decisions or communications. The back-and-forth rhythm intensified. What had once been a calm hearing room now felt charged with energy. Even those who had been only casually paying attention earlier were now fully engaged in the exchange. Unfolding before them, the tension wasn't explosive, but it was unmistakable. Moments like this are often what transform routine hearings into headline-making events. Because in those moments, The conversation moves beyond prepared statements and scripted talking points. It becomes a genuine debate. By the time Bondi finished one of her longer explanations, the entire room seemed to be listening closely. The lawmaker paused before asking the next question. Bondi sat upright, hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. Neither side appeared ready to back down, and just like that, what had begun as a routine question had evolved into one of the most closely watched exchanges of the entire hearing. The hearing still had many minutes left to go, but in that moment, one thing was already clear. Everyone in the room, lawmakers, staff members, journalists, and viewers watching from afar knew they were witnessing a moment that had changed the tone of the proceedings. The hearing was no longer routine. Now, it had everyone's full attention. By this point in the hearing, the change in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Even the people seated in the very back rows of the room far from the microphones and cameras sensed that something had shifted. The earlier exchanges had followed the familiar rhythm of a congressional hearing: questions asked, answers given, and occasional moments of disagreement. But now the energy in the room felt different, more focused, more tense. Reporters sitting along the sidewalls began typing rapidly on their laptops, trying to capture every word before the moment passed. Some leaned forward in their chairs, eyes locked on the table at the front of the room. Camera operators quietly adjusted their positions, tilting their lenses slightly to capture the expressions on the faces of those speaking. They knew moments like this could quickly become the defining clip from a long day of testimony. Political hearings can sometimes feel routine, even predictable. But every so often, they produce moments that cut through the formality, moments when emotions, convictions, and sharp disagreements suddenly become visible to everyone watching. This felt like one of those moments. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. Despite the tension building around her, Bondi remained remarkably composed. Her posture stayed steady. Her voice didn't rise. And even as the questioning from committee members became more pointed, she continued responding in a measured, deliberate way. Those who had watched her career before knew that this was not unfamiliar territory for her. Years spent as Attorney General of Florida had placed her in countless high-pressure situations: courtrooms filled with opposing attorneys, press conferences surrounded by flashing cameras, and legislative hearings where every word could become tomorrow's headline. But this exchange seemed to carry a particular weight. As one lawmaker pressed forward with a more critical line of questioning, the room grew noticeably quieter. Conversations among staff members stopped. Even the rustling of papers faded. Bondi listened carefully. She didn't interrupt. She allowed the lawmaker to finish outlining their concerns, even as the tone suggested skepticism about decisions made during her time in office. Then, when it was her turn to respond, she leaned slightly toward the microphone. Her answer was calm but firm. Rather than simply defending herself in broad terms, Bondi began explaining the context behind the decisions being discussed. She spoke about the responsibilities that come with holding public office and the legal frameworks that guide those decisions. Her words were carefully chosen, but the message was unmistakable. At one point during her response, Bondi paused briefly before making a statement that seemed to echo throughout the hearing room. Public officials, she said, often face criticism from many directions. That, she acknowledged, is part of the job. But regardless of the political pressure or public debate surrounding an issue, decisions made by those in office must always follow the law and established procedures. For a moment, the room felt still. It was one of those rare pauses during a hearing when everyone present seemed to absorb what had just been said. Some of the reporters stopped typing for a second, glancing up from their screens. A few members of the audience exchanged quick looks with one another. Even the committee members appeared to take a brief pause before moving on to the next question. The tension that had been building only minutes earlier seemed to soften, at least slightly. But the earlier confrontation had already left its mark. Moments like this have a way of lingering in the memory of those who witness them. They reveal not only the disagreements at the heart of political debates, but also the personalities and convictions of the people involved. For the reporters in the room, it was clear they had just captured one of the defining moments of the hearing. The kind of moment that would later be replayed on television, analyzed by commentators, and debated by viewers long after the hearing itself ended. As the questioning continued, the formal rhythm of the proceedings slowly returned. New topics were introduced. Different lawmakers took their turns speaking. But the energy in the room had undeniably changed. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed one of the most intense exchanges of the day, a brief but powerful flash of confrontation that revealed how deeply the issues being discussed were felt by those involved. And while the hearing moved forward, That moment hung in the air, reminding everyone in the room that behind every question, every answer, and every line of testimony were real decisions, real responsibilities, and real consequences. As the hearing gradually moved toward its conclusion, something in the atmosphere of the room had clearly changed. Earlier in the day, the proceedings had followed a familiar rhythm. Lawmakers asked questions, witnesses responded, staff members quietly passed documents back and forth while reporters typed notes on their laptops. It was the kind of steady, procedural pace that many government hearings follow. But after the exchange between Pam Bondi and one of the committee members, that routine feeling was gone. The room felt different. The conversation that had taken place only minutes earlier had become the moment everyone was talking about, not because voices had been raised, not because anyone had stormed out, but because of the way the exchange captured something deeper about how hearings like this actually work. In many ways, congressional hearings are often viewed by the public as formal events filled with legal language, prepared statements, and carefully structured questions. And while that is often true, moments like this reveal that there is much more happening beneath the surface. These hearings are not simply about reading statements into the record. They are places where competing perspectives meet face to face. Lawmakers come into the room with concerns, criticisms, and questions they believe deserve answers. Witnesses arrive, prepared to explain, defend, and sometimes challenge the assumptions behind those questions. Most of the time, that process unfolds in a calm and orderly way. But occasionally, a particular question or response cuts deeper than expected. That is when the tension that has been quietly building throughout the day suddenly becomes visible. That was exactly what had happened during Bondi's exchange with the lawmaker. When the questioning began, it seemed like just another routine line of inquiry. The committee member leaned forward and began outlining a series of statements, setting the stage for the question that followed. At first, Bondi listened carefully, allowing the lawmaker to finish speaking. She didn't interrupt, she didn't react visibly, she simply waited for the full question to be presented. But as the exchange continued, it became clear that the framing of the question carried a particular implication about decisions made during her time in public office. That was the moment when Bondi chose not to simply give a short answer and move on. Instead, she addressed the premise of the question directly. Her response was calm, measured, and deliberate. Rather than raising her voice or becoming defensive, she explained that the situation being described was more complex than the question suggested. She outlined the legal responsibilities her office had at the time. She described the information that was available when those decisions were made, and she emphasized that public officials often have to make difficult choices based on incomplete or evolving circumstances. As she spoke, the tone in the room shifted. Some lawmakers leaned back in their chairs, listening closely. Others glanced down at their notes, perhaps preparing follow-up questions. Reporters continued typing, aware that this moment was becoming one of the defining exchanges of the hearing. The exchange didn't last very long, but it left a lasting impression, not because it was dramatic in the way political arguments sometimes become dramatic. Instead, it stood out because it revealed the underlying purpose of hearings like this. They are not simply ceremonial events. They are forums where decisions made by public officials are examined in detail. Lawmakers ask questions on behalf of the public. Witnesses explain their reasoning, their actions, and the context surrounding those decisions. And sometimes, those conversations reveal disagreements about how events should be interpreted. For Bondi, the moment demonstrated her willingness to address difficult questions directly rather than avoiding them. Throughout the hearing, she remained composed and focused, even when the questioning became more pointed. For the committee members, the exchange illustrated the role they play in closely examining the actions of public officials. Part of their responsibility is to challenge explanations, ask follow-up questions, and explore whether decisions were made appropriately. That process can sometimes lead to uncomfortable conversations. But those conversations are often where the most important insights emerge. For viewers, following the hearing, whether they were watching live or reading about it afterward, the moment served as a reminder that the political process is rarely as simple as it appears. Behind every carefully worded question lies a broader debate. Behind every answer lies a longer story about the decisions that shaped it. And when those questions and answers meet in the same room, the result can be a moment that changes the tone of the entire discussion. By the time the hearing finally began winding down, the earlier exchange was still lingering in people's minds. Staff members gathered their papers. Lawmakers prepared for the next item on the schedule. But the moment between Bondi and the lawmaker had already become the part of the hearing that many people would remember most. Because sometimes, it only takes a single exchange to reveal what these hearings are really about. Different perspectives, different interpretations, and the ongoing effort to understand the choices made by those in positions of public responsibility. Behind every question, there is a debate. Behind every answer, there is a story, and every once in a while, those stories collide in a way that shifts the entire mood of the room, reminding everyone watching that democracy is not always quiet, simple, or predictable. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events, and don't forget to drop a comment below. Which moment surprised you the most? Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.